There's a particular moment, and if you used AI recently, you probably had it, where you ask a question and the answer comes back so complete, so fluent, so confident, so precise that for just a second you think, how did we ever manage without this? And honestly, that reaction isn't wrong. The tools that have emerged in just the last few years represent one of the most significant shifts in how human beings access and process information in the last several centuries. From medicine to law to engineering to education, and not surprisingly, war. AI systems are doing things that were, not long ago, genuinely impossible for a machine to do. The enthusiasm around these tools is not irrational. The people who use them daily and swear by them are not naive. At the same time, however, the people who look at AI with deep suspicion, who worry about what it means for the truth, for work, for human judgment, they aren't wrong either. Both things are simultaneously true, which is uncomfortable, but that's where we are. What's harder to argue with is the trajectory. Organizations are not waiting for the philosophical debate to settle. Businesses are integrating AI into their operations right now. Law firms are using it for research and sometimes flawed legal filings. News organizations are using it for content, and school systems are just trying to figure out how to incorporate it without it destroying the learning process of the students. Governments are using it for everything from benefits processing to national security analysis. The trust being placed in these systems, institutionally, professionally, legally, and even seemingly philosophically, is accelerating faster than our collective understanding of what these systems actually are. I'm not here to tell you AI is good or bad. My focus is to explore what AI actually is as a tool, which means understanding not just what it can do, but specifically how and why it fails. And more importantly, what you can do about it to make sure those failures are less likely to happen when you use it. What do I know? So before we get into this, all the details about AI and how to check it, you're probably wondering, why is this guy talking about it? What does he know? I decided to make this episode kind of a foundational episode of my channel. I've already got about 20 episodes now, but I figured if there's any episode that would be great as a foundational episode, it's this one, because it gets to the heart of a question that is becoming more and more vital to our society. And that is, what is intelligence? What is analysis? And who is making the decisions? For most of human history, it's always been humans. Whether it was kings or priests and popes, or just a regular guy who thought to make an invention that ended up transforming the world, or an opposition group that said, wait a minute, we don't like what's going on here. We're going to change it. There were always individuals involved, individual human beings involved. Now we're dealing with machines that, well, on the face of it, looks like they're reasoning, that they have almost in some ways consciousness. At least some people think so. Of course, that's debatable because we don't even know what consciousness really is. But back to the topic at hand, we're dealing with machines that now are being plugged into systems of power, systems of discretion, systems of decisions, sometimes of medical decisions, sometimes of literal life and death. And we're going at it in a way that is accelerating. And the competition that naturally happens geopolitically, also at the company level. You have companies that are trying to compete to be dominant within the market, within the AI market. So they're going to push the envelope. They're going to reduce the protections. They're going to plug it in more and more. The customers, which is going to be the government agencies and these large multinational corporations, they're going to want to use it more and more because they think that's going to give them a benefit over their competitor. This gets dangerous when you start talking about nation states, the United States, Russia, China, other countries that have very powerful militaries. And there is a natural disposition within political organizations to use these systems, to use whatever is available to them to get ahead of the other country. And this is dangerous, especially if you plug in these systems to deciding who lives and who dies. But that is going to be a different discussion, a different episode. There's a lot of questions there, and that's going to take up a whole other episode. We're going to go back to that later. This question right here about how to deal with these systems, how to deal with a system that seems so human-like, but is not human. that has so much human information, but provides data that you have no idea how it concluded what it did. And so this kind of goes into the larger idea of my channel, because my channel is basically, I wanted to look at how institutions shape and influence power, and power in the sense of exerting influence and change on individuals and groups. And there is no other bigger concern right now, and probably won't be for a while, than what's happening now with artificial intelligence, now taking the place of decision makers, which normally are human beings. And so I'm going to use this as kind of a foundational episode, and I also wanted to introduce myself, and so I could refer to this episode. My background, I have a bachelor's degree in political science, and I have a master's degree in public policy administration. But what does that have to do with AI? Well, nothing, but then also everything. The take I take on this, I don't have an expertise in artificial intelligence. I don't know the inner workings of what's inside. But what I do know, what I have been taught from those years in college, is not necessarily, the books that I read, but how I went about learning, how I went about deciphering information, how I went about questioning information, and how I went about actually assessing things critically. And at the end of the day, this episode is not just about artificial intelligence, it's about critical analysis. It's about looking at information that you get and not trusting it until you check it. Knowing that there are always going to be hidden levers, always going to be mechanisms, whether it's technical, political, philosophical, that are going to be moving things in one direction that might not necessarily be the truth. And with all that being said, let's get to it. Confident and incorrect. Let's start with the most immediate problem, the one you'll encounter every single time you use an AI system, whether you notice it or not. AI is confident, consistently, fluently, and almost always confident, regardless of whether the information it's delivering is accurate, incomplete, outdated, or simply wrong. This is not a bug in the conventional sense. It's a consequence of how these systems are built. AI language models are trained to produce responses that are coherent, complete, and natural sounding. They are optimized at a fundamental level for fluency. And fluency, it turns out, sounds a lot like confidence. The same smooth, well-constructed sentence that carries accurate information carries inaccurate information in exactly the same way. The tone doesn't change. The pacing doesn't change. There's no tell. When a human expert is uncertain, you usually know it. They hedge. They say, I think, or if I recall correctly, or you'd want to check that. They slow down. There are signals, verbal, tonal, sometimes physical, that calibrate how much weight you should give what they're saying. Those signals exist because human communication evolved partly as a trust mechanism. We learned to broadcast our own uncertainty because it matters to the people listening. AI has no equivalent mechanism, at least not as far as I could tell. Or rather, it sometimes produces the words of uncertainty without the underlying reality of it. It will occasionally say, I'm not entirely sure, and then give you a wrong answer with the same smooth delivery as a right one. The disclaimer becomes part of the fluency rather than a genuine signal. This creates a specific kind of risk that's worth naming carefully. The problem isn't just that AI gets things wrong. Every information source gets things wrong. Encyclopedias, textbooks, experts, journalists. The problem is that with most of those other sources, error tends to come with some kind of signal. With AI, that signal is largely absent. There is a term researchers use for a specific version of this problem. It's called hallucination. That's when AI doesn't just get something wrong, but generates something that has no basis in fact at all. A study that doesn't exist, a quote that was never said, a case that was never decided, and presents those hallucinations in the same fluent, confident tone as everything else. Hallucinations are not rare cases. They happen with enough regularity that anyone using AI for research or any other high-stakes purpose needs to treat them as a genuine operational risk. There have been lawyers who submitted AI-generated briefs containing citations to cases that never happened. There have been journalists who have published AI-assisted stories containing fabricated details. The counter here is a fundamental reorientation of how you receive AI output. Stop treating it as an answer and start treating it as a first draft from a very well-read research assistant. The assistant has read more than you have. The assistant can synthesize faster than you can. But the assistant is not accountable for being wrong, does not always know when it's wrong, and will not always tell you when it's guessing. Everything that matters gets verified. Not because AI is uniquely untrustworthy, but because the confidence signal that would normally tell you what needs verifying is missing. So read that response, but then double check that response yourself. Question its sources. If the confidence problem is about how AI delivers information, the authority bias problem is about which information AI decided to learn from in the first place. And this one runs deeper because it's less visible and more systemic. To understand it, you have to understand how these systems are trained. AI language models learn by processing enormous quantities of text. We're talking about a significant fraction of the written material that exists in digital form. Books, articles, academic papers, government documents, news archives, websites. The scale is genuinely difficult to comprehend. And from that material, the system develops what you might think of as a map of how ideas relate to each other. Which claims tend to appear together, which sources tend to be cited, which explanations tend to follow which questions. But here's the critical point. That map is not built on truth. It's built on frequency and citation patterns. What that AI treats as most reliable and most established is what appeared most often in the most widely distributed sources, cited by the most other sources. To put it plainly, volume and reach determine weight. Repetition becomes a proxy for reliability. And who produces the most volume? Who has the most reach? Who gets cited most widely across the largest number of sources? Institutions do. Governments do. Major universities do. Large media organizations do. Established professional bodies do. This isn't a conspiracy, it's just math. Institutional sources produce more content, distribute it more widely, and get cited more frequently than independent researchers. It gets more visibility than minority viewpoints, dissenting scholars, or local and specialized knowledge. So the AI's default map of reality is, structurally, an institutionally weighted map of reality. Not because anyone decided it should be, but because that's what the training data reflects. Many times these institutions genuinely might have the best information, but sometimes, perhaps not. Institutions are not neutral. They never have been. Governments produce narratives about their history, their own policies, their own legitimacy that are, to put it diplomatically, incomplete. Academic fields develop consensus positions that can persist long after the evidence has moved on, partly because the people who built the consensus are also the people who run the journals and award the grants. Major media organizations operate within political and commercial constraints that shape what they cover, how they frame it, and what they leave out. And none of this is a secret. Historians, sociologists, and media critics have documented it extensively. Even psychologists coined a term for it, authority bias. The problem is that AI inherits all this without labeling it. When you ask an AI a question that touches on contested political history, or disputed economic theory, or ongoing public health debates, or maybe any area where institutional narratives have a stake in the outcome, you are not getting a neutral synthesis of available knowledge. You are getting a response that is systematically weighted toward whatever the dominant institutional sources said most frequently. And the AI doesn't always know that it's doing this. It usually just reflects the shape of its training data, and the shape of its training data reflects the shape of institutional power. So what do you do about it? First, know which domains you're in. If you're asking about a math problem or a chemical compound, the authority bias is actually working in your favor. But if you're asking about why a war started, why an economic policy succeeded or failed, what a government did or didn't do, understand that the answer you're getting has been pre-filtered through the sources that had the most to say about those subjects. Second, ask the AI directly about the limits of its perspective on contested topics. Ask it whether the question is disputed. Ask it what alternative interpretations exist. A well-designed AI system will often acknowledge complexity when you push for it. It just won't volunteer that acknowledgement unprompted, however. Third, and we'll go more into this later, trace the sources. Find out whose account the AI is drawing from, because knowing the origin of a claim is the first step toward evaluating it. And that's a step the AI will not normally take for you. The AI gives you the consensus. Your job is to ask who built the consensus and why. The guardrail problem. So we've talked about what AI gets wrong unintentionally. Now let's talk about what AI withholds deliberately. Every AI system you interact with has been shaped, before you ever typed your first question, by a set of decisions made by the people and organizations that built it. Those decisions determine not just how the system behaves, but what it will and won't engage with, what it will say directly, what it will say only partially, and what it will deflect, soften, or refuse to say entirely. These are called guardrails. and every major AI system has them. What's worth understanding is the full range of reasons those guardrails exist, because they aren't all the same kind of thing. Some guardrails are straightforward and hard to argue with. AI systems are restricted from helping people do things that are clearly harmful. For instance, producing certain kinds of dangerous technical instructions or facilitating targeted harassment. Most people would agree those restrictions belong there. So this isn't about those kind of guardrails. What this section is about is a much larger and murkier category of restrictions that exist for reasons that have nothing to do with clear physical harm, and instead with legal exposure, commercial relationships, political sensitivities, and reputational risk. AI companies are businesses. The systems they build operate in legal jurisdictions with different rules about defamation, liability, and regulated industries. They often have corporate relationships with other institutions, media companies, government agencies, academic bodies, whose goodwill matters to them commercially. And of course, they operate in political environments where being seen to produce certain kinds of content creates problems for them publicly. All that shapes the guardrails, and the guardrails shape what you get. This means there are entire categories of questions where the AI's responses have been pre-calibrated, not toward accuracy or completeness, but toward safety. And safety in this context means safety for the company, not necessarily usefulness for you. In all these areas, the AI might give you an answer that is technically not wrong, but is carefully constructed to avoid saying anything that creates risk for the developer. And the AI will not always tell you that it's doing this. Sometimes it will. Sometimes systems are reasonably transparent about declining to engage with certain topics, and will tell you directly that they can't help with a particular request. But that's the best case scenario. At least you know to go elsewhere. But in many cases, the guardrail doesn't announce itself. Instead of a refusal, you get an answer that is just thin. It's vague. It covers the surface of the question without going anywhere near the substance of it. When I imagine this, I think about the neutral people in Futurama. If you don't know about them, look them up. It's kind of funny, but also true in this regard. And because of the confidence problem discussed earlier, because the delivery is smooth and complete sounded regardless, you may not even notice that you didn't actually get what you asked for. So what to do about this? First, pay attention to the texture of the responses you're getting. Learn what a deflected answer feels like, because it has a feeling. I've seen it, I felt it. I'm like, this is not telling me what I need to. There's something going on here. When a topic feels oddly shallow, or when the AI seems to be talking around something rather than about it, treat that as a signal. The shape of an invasion is itself information. If you suspect a guardrail is operating, try approaching the question from a different angle. Ask about the history of the topic rather than the topic directly. Ask what critics of the official position have argued. Ask the AI to describe the range of perspectives that exist. You won't always get past the restriction, but you'll often get further than the first response suggested was possible. And when you've gone as far as the AI will take you, go somewhere else. The AI is not the only tool. It's not even always the best tool. Primary sources, investigative journalism, academic literature outside the mainstream, and direct human expertise all exist and all remain accessible. The guardrail simply tells you where the AI stops being useful. Your job is to recognize that and keep going. The silence has a shape. Learn to read it. The analysis problem. This is the section where we need to make a distinction that sounds simple but has consequences that are anything but. There is a difference between retrieving information and analyzing it. Retrieval is finding what exists. Analysis is reasoning about what it means. They are not the same skill. They do not require the same capabilities. And this is the critical point. AI is very good at one of them and not so much with the other. The problem is that it performs both in a way that makes them look identical. When you ask an AI a factual question, what year did something happen? What does a particular law say? What is the chemical composition of a substance? You are asking it to retrieve. And retrieval is genuinely what these systems were built to do. But the moment you ask an AI what something means, why an event happened, what the implications of a policy are, whether an argument holds together, you have crossed the line into analysis. And that is where the limitation begins. And here's why. Analysis requires something that goes beyond pattern recognition. It requires the ability to reason from first principles, to take a set of facts or premises, apply logic and judgment to them, and then arrive at a conclusion that isn't simply a recombination of conclusions that already existed somewhere in the training data. It requires the ability to hold uncertainty, weigh competing interpretations, recognize the limits of available evidence, and sometimes arrive to the conclusion that, well, a conclusion can't be made at this point. AI often doesn't do this. What it does instead is something that looks very much like analysis, but is, at its core, a sophisticated form of pattern matching. It has processed an enormous amount of human reasoning, and it has learned the structure and language of analytical thought. When you ask it to analyze something, it produces output that has the form of analysis. It uses the vocabulary of reasoning. It structures arguments. It weighs considerations. It draws conclusions. It can do all of this fluently and at length. But what it's actually doing is recognizing that questions of this type tend to be answered in this kind of way, and constructing a response that fits that pattern. The conclusion it gives you isn't the result of independent reasoning applied to the specific problem in front of it. It's a recombination of analytical moves that appeared in similar contexts in its training data. There's a specific danger here that's worth naming, because AI analytical output is fluent and structured and often plausible. It can actually interfere with your own thinking rather than support it. If you read a well-constructed AI analysis of a problem before you've done your own thinking, you've already been anchored. The frame has been set. The considerations that the AI chose to include and exclude have shaped the space in which your thinking will now occur. It actually set the starting point for you. You are no longer reasoning from scratch. You're reacting to a pre-existing structure, and that structure was built from the weighted average of existing institutional arguments, filtered through the guardrails mentioned earlier. That's a meaningful constraint on independent thought, and most people don't notice it happening. So what do you do about it? Well, use AI for retrieval. Use it to gather material, map existing arguments, and identify what has already been said about a problem. That's the tool working at its genuine strength. But save the analysis for yourself. Form your own view of what the material means before you ask the AI what it thinks. And you could use AI analysis as a check on your own reasoning, something to push up against, something to identify considerations you might have missed, instead of a replacement for your own reasoning. The moment you hand the analytical function to the AI, you've outsourced the most important part of any research endeavor. So the retrieval is real. The analysis is often performance. And knowing which is one of the most important things you could aim for. Outdated knowledge. This one is in some ways the most straightforward limitation, and yet it's one of the most consistently overlooked, probably because the fluency problem makes it invisible in practice. AI has a knowledge cutoff. That means every AI system you interact with was trained on data that stops at a particular point in time. After that point, as far as the AI is concerned, nothing happened. The world froze. And the AI, unless it has been specifically equipped with tools that allow it to access current information, is operating from a snapshot of the world that may be months or, in some cases, years out of date. For anything time-sensitive, current events, recent research, verify independently through current sources before acting on what the AI tells you. And also simply just ask the AI where it stopped its training data. A lot of times you could ask it to do a search, and then even ask it what it thinks its limitations of its search is. There's no perfect solution, but as long as you go in knowing that it's a problem, you're well ahead of the curve. The black box problem. So let's establish something before we go further, because it matters for what follows. The people who build AI systems are not composed of just successful technologists. The major AI laboratories contain some of the most rigorously trained scientists and engineers in the world. The research that underlies modern AI represents decades of work by thousands of highly credentialed people across universities, government institutions, and private organizations. Those people, the builders, the researchers, the theorists, the people who have dedicated their professional lives to understanding and developing these systems, they will tell you that there is a fundamental sense in which they do not know what is happening inside the systems they have built. The field has terms for the effort to achieve that understanding: interpretability and explainability. These refer broadly to attempts to understand why an AI system produced a given output, what internal representations, mechanisms, and learned features contribute to it, and how. This is one of the most active areas of AI research today, and one reason it is so active is that for modern large models, the problem remains substantially unsolved. What we have instead is a system that takes inputs and produces outputs. And between those 2 points, there is a process of almost incomprehensible complexity. Billions of parameters interacting in ways that produce results that are often impressive, sometimes wrong, occasionally bizarre, and not fully accountable to the outside examination. The researchers can measure the outputs, They can adjust the training to push the outputs in certain directions. They can identify some patterns in how these systems behave, but the complete causal story, the full account of why this input produced that output, it's not available to them. Not yet, at least. And possibly not for a long time. And who knows, maybe not ever. And think about it, we still don't fully understand how we develop our own thought processes. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, wait a minute, I saw something. I saw it reasoning. Some AI products have introduced what they call reasoning features. You may have seen these. The AI visibly works through a problem step by step, showing what looks like its thought process before arriving at a conclusion. These features are real, and they do provide some additional transparency compared to a system that just produces a final answer with no visible process. But they need to be understood for what they are. The visible chain of reasoning that these features display is itself an output of the system. It is the AI producing a description of reasoning in the same way it produces any other text, by generating what a reasoning process looks like based on patterns in its training data. It is not a direct readout of the underlying computational process. It is not a window into the mechanics. The reasoning display and the actual internal process that generated the answer are not necessarily the same thing. In other words, it could just be lying to you. I mean, how do we know? Think of it this way. If you ask someone how they made a decision and they give you an explanation, that explanation is a reconstruction. It's a story they're telling about a process that actually involved subconscious pattern recognition, emotional weighting, incomplete memory, and cognitive shortcuts that they have no direct access to. The explanation may be sincere. It may even be partially accurate, but it is not the same as the actual process. The same is true in a more fundamental way for AI reasoning displays. And this isn't a fringe position or an outside criticism. Some of the most significant figures in the history of AI development have said versions of this publicly. We are in a situation that has few good historical parallels. We have built something that works demonstrably, impressively, at enormous scale, and we do not fully understand why it works. And this also means we do not fully understand when it will stop working, or fail in unexpected ways, or produce outputs that are wrong in ways we can't anticipate, because we can't fully see the internal logic that would let us predict them. And we are simultaneously placing increasing institutional trust in these systems, letting them inform decisions in medicine, law, finance, governance, education, pretty much every single important aspect of our society. And in some ways, not just inform the decision, but actually make the decision themselves. That combination, high trust, limited comprehensibility, is the thing that the people inside the field worry most about. And it's worth the rest of us worrying about too. Not to the point of paralysis, not as a reason to abandon the tools, but as a reason for us to treat the output with healthy skepticism. The builders don't have the complete picture. The theorists don't have the complete picture. Nobody does. You may feel like you've built a rapport with that AI, that you could trust it, but in reality, it's designed to make you feel that way. So just don't let your guard down.